Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today is a familiar face. We have just covered this chap in the basics video where we went over thinning your paints, applying them into thin coats, and applying a wash over the top to get some depth and shading. But today what we're going to do is a little bit extra. We're going to come back, do some highlights, and a couple of funky little finishing touches, which I think really helps improve the look. Now nothing here is too difficult. It is still in the realm of just thin your paints and keep control of your brush, which we covered yesterday. So hopefully it's going to be nice and simple. Now there aren't too many additional paints that we're going to be using, but I will include them in the description along with all of the paints that we did use yesterday. So if you just want to add them all to a shopping list, you can do that. So without any further mucking around, let's get started. So here we have the Grenadier that we painted yesterday. Now this is a pretty decent standard for putting an army on the table. A whole bunch of these guys, maybe 30 to 50 miniatures on the table looking like this. They're going to look great. As an army in particular, think about how the whole unit is going to look. This is going to be perfect. But chances are good, you're probably going to want to push it a little bit further as you grow more confident in your skills. So that's what we're going to do today. So first things first, let's go ahead and start doing some highlights. Now, the easiest way to highlight anything, if you have gone ahead and hit it with a strong tone or a similar wash, is to just go back to your base colors and paint a little of those over the top again. So what I'm going to do here is start off with Agate skin, and we're going to paint in his skin. So here what I'm going to do, just a little bit on the end of my brush, is just to paint in the lines on the back of his hand, passing over those a couple of times, just leaving a little bit of the shaded skin tone in the recesses. Now importantly here, a lot of folks will go straight to the very smallest brush they can, and that's not always the easiest way to do this sort of thing. What's more important is the tip that your brush will keep. So I'm still painting all of this with a regiment brush, which is roughly equivalent to a size 1, maybe a size 2. But because it keeps a point, and bearing in mind what I mentioned about thinning down your paint yesterday so that you can still control it, I can put that exactly where I want. Now as a quick tip, while you're painting in faces, what you can do is leave the bottom lip. Don't bother highlighting it, just leave it the shaded color that you've got already, and it will look good. With a little bit of depth reintroduced to his skin there, what I'm going to do is the same thing again, but I'm only going to do it with a couple of colors. You don't have to do this with things like his helmet or any of the painted metallic stuff. We are going to do something different with that. And really dark things like the oak straps and his black webbing, well, I'm not going to bother with that either. So what I have is my German field grey. I'm going to do this to his uniform, and I will do it as well to the khaki on his bread bag. But otherwise, that's going to be plenty. Now here, on sleeves and stuff in particular, you can have a bit of fun. It is a matter of style choice here. I see people doing really cool things, introducing a lot more texture by leaving a little bit more of the shaded stuff intact. So have some fun with this. Experiment a little on what you think looks good. But as you get an eye for it, you'll start to see how you can add a bit more shape to your own miniatures here. So I'm going to go over those colors I mentioned. So there we've got a little bit more depth on his uniform and on the pack there, the bread bag. Now you can do this with all of the base colors, but I'm going to suggest you don't necessarily need to. And in particular on his camouflage, what we're going to do is something slightly different to get a bit more contrast in those patches. It's going to look really cool. I'm going to put him aside for a second though, because what I want to show you is mixing paints for your highlights. So on my wet palette here, I have a couple of the colors that I've already been using to highlight. What I've got in my hand is ivory. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be ivory, but any light, like really light off-white with just a little bit of warmth to it is going to be much better than using white. White's going to give you a much more washed out color, and it's not ideally what we want. So once I've got my little dollops here, what I'm going to do, this is very similar to how one would mix water into your paints. Just grab a little bit of ivory out of my dollop there, and I'm going to mix it into my field grey. What this is going to give me is a slightly lighter, but still noticeably field grey highlight colour. So once I'm satisfied with that, and the trick here is usually adding a little bit at a time is a much better idea than splodging it all in. And if you add tiny bits, you can always add more if it turns out that it isn't light enough. So once I am satisfied with that, what I'll do is grab a little bit of my brush, same as I have been, and then I find it easiest to angle the miniature as I'm holding them so that I just draw my brush straight down to get a straight line. I'll highlight just a couple of bits. There we go, at the edges of any creases, like really high points in the uniform. So turning them again, and then straight lines, holding my brush near the tip so I've got the most control. You don't have to do much of this, and to be honest, if you do a lot of it, it will very quickly overpower the color, make it look a little washed out, which is not what you want, but a few bits just to enhance the shapes that you've already added there. Now, if you find while you're painting that that's not leaving as much of a mark as you'd like, you can just dot in a little bit more ivory at a time and just keep experimenting until you're getting what you'd like. It is a skill that needs a little bit of practice, and you will learn very quickly to eyeball it, but the first few times, adding less ivory at a time is going to help you out. So I'm now going to do the same thing with the khaki off screen, just quickly highlight that bread bag the way I'd like. And when it comes to the uniform, what I've done is started by adding a little bit of ivory to some of that chocolate brown that we used as our brown color. And what I'll do is pick a section, just this little bit at the front here is probably a good place to start. And what we're going to do is, instead of filling in the areas, is just to add a bit of texture with some short, straight lines. So particularly on his back is a good shot for this. Just a few short lines. And then leave the darker brown in the recesses, similarly to how we did on his face. So this bit here, up on his other shoulder, there's a crease here that we want to sharpen up a bit. And then this darker section we'll leave. So with our mix, we're going to go straight to highlighting all of the camouflage pattern. And I'm going to do this, first of all, with the chocolate brown, and then I will come back and do it off screen with the other two colors. You'll see very quickly how much of a difference that's going to make. So by concentrating on adding texture and skipping out that mid-tone highlight that we had done, for example, with the uniform, what you get is a nice, slightly more realistic looking camouflage pattern, because there's lots of little dips, nooks, crannies, bits that you've missed, bits that you have highlighted. This can take a little bit of getting used to, but it is a skill to practice. Now, it's going to be a little time consuming when you first get started, but it isn't difficult to do, and it's a great technique to practice, because that amount of brush control you're going to find useful no matter what you're painting. So I'm going to flip him around here, and I'm going to go back over his rifle with a little bit of leather brown, because I think I did lift some of that off with the shade, because I hadn't let it dry properly. So whoops, let's just block a bit more of that in. The name Gunmetal is going to get you a bunch of different colors depending on which manufacturer you go to. If you are using the Army Painter's Gunmetal and you're popping a little bit of the dark tone over the top, that will work very well. But because I've done things slightly differently here, what I have is Gunmetal from Vallejo Game Color range. I quite like this one because it is so dark. You'll see just a few little pings of this, just to accentuate, and I'm going to say it again, the gunmetal. You don't have to completely cover the metalwork with this, just enough to catch the edges and make them look a little scuffed and used. Now that's one way that you can add a little bit of life to your metallic details, but there's another which works super well if you're looking at metalwork which is going to be dinged around, knocked about. So for our mess tin, our gas mask canister, and our helmet, what I'm going to do here is grab, this is a B pencil, something nice and soft. What you can do is angle this so that you catch the edge of the metalwork. So let's get the bottom of the mess tin here, and with just the edge of the pencil, wiggle it back and forth a few times, and you have a nice shiny ding. Now this works for all your metalwork. So the edges of his canister here, I'm just going to pass over this corner a couple of times. Then I'll hold them up straight, And let's do a couple of lines along the canister itself, and even along the front of his helmet, just enough to make it look like it's seen some action. So corners and edges that are going to see a lot of action, this is where you want to just buff with a bit of pencil. This is an old armor modeling trick I remember from a magazine I must have read, oh gosh, longer ago than I care to admit, but it works on all sorts of things. Now from certain angles, that is fairly subtle, but you turn them the right way, and you see suddenly those little scratches and dings stand out. The more of that you apply, the fresher and the more recent those scratches are going to look. Now, the last thing that I am going to do is to grab myself a little bit of barbarian flesh, and we're going to do some last highlights on his skin. So what we're going to aim for here is along the backs of his knuckles, for example. Little dots of this to help sell the shape of his hands. And then up on his face, what we want to do is bop in his nose, and on his cheekbones, just a little horizontal line to add a bit of depth to his cheeks. Fellas who've got the chin strap, of course, you're not going to be able to do it, but a little bit on their chins as well is a good way to add a bit more depth to the face. Now, if you're feeling particularly cheeky, you can grab a little bit of your ivory from earlier, and a thin line of that across this exposed teeth will really set the face off. Some folks like to paint eyes, but I reckon for your World War II guys, it's a matter of personal taste. I just don't see the point in doing it. At the ranges you're going to see these guys, you wouldn't see a normal man's eyes anyhow. But what I am going to do is apply a little of the brush-on varnish that I mentioned yesterday. I'm going to put this over everything. And then once that varnish has dried thoroughly, our soldier is complete, again. Now, this is a really great way to go back and touch up an army if you've put down something, you've put down your base coats and your washes, and you're happy with how the army looks, but once you've played a few games, you want to come back and improve the look. Now, nothing here is particularly complex. I think maybe the most unusual thing you might see compared to most is to mix your highlights, but it's a good skill to have, and I do recommend having a practice of it, play around, and experiment with what you can get out of it. In particular, going back and making your clothing a little bit more faded with a touch of ivory in there looks really cool. So again, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.